Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories was released in November of 2004 on the Game Boy Advance, and right from the start of its existence, it is an oddity, as it was released the exact same year and month as the Nintendo DS. Although missing the timing was probably a good thing, as combining the Kingdom Hearts development team, proclivities of Tetsuya Nomura, and the strange touchscreen implementations of early DS games, there is a non-zero chance that the game could have just ended up as a tax return simulator with even more plot-crucial secret cutscenes. Part of the reason it released so late into the GBA's lifecycle is probably because it almost didn't even exist at all, as apparently Nomura was not super sold on the idea until he heard children wanted to play Kingdom Hearts on their Game Boys, and it is the 25th best-selling GBA game of all time, so what was the numbers department even doing? The overwhelming popularity of the system, combined with well-received games released around the same time, much like Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, meant that the Game Boy Advance competed with the DS for several years. But sure thing, marketing department, let's wait for the children to protest outside company headquarters. What were you doing? I was one of those kids, because like many children, I would play the things that interested me on the system that I had, no matter the downgrade. Why hello, Spider-Man Web of Shadows Amazing Allies Edition? How were you legal? I got the game for my Nintendo DS, and at that point Kingdom Hearts 2 was already out, and I had a PlayStation 2, it's how I knew about the series, so I was not exactly locked in. I've always had kind of a complicated relationship with the game, like, it was the second one I played, it has very beautiful pixel art, the remake adapts it pretty well, and it has the characters as I remember them, so I should have a lot of nostalgia for it, but I kind of hate it, and I never really got close to finishing it as a child. And I am including Chain of Memories, or Recom, which is almost always the game people are referring to, including myself, when they say Chain of Memories. It's widely available on modern hardware, fully voiced, animated, and we can bemoan the artistic integrity all day, but the original was designed for fewer pixels than most people's watches. It hasn't aged perfectly. I will be mentioning several issues the game has, and while some of those things apply to the original, some of them were introduced in the remake. Along with extremely charming pixel art, there are genuine reasons to prefer, if not exclusively recommend, the original. I am not one of those people. It still remains intriguing to me, but the added cards, combos, cutscenes, music, and about 1,000 other things makes it hard to justify going back. Plus, with Recom, you get one of the best cutscenes in the entire series, if not gaming as a whole.
Because I'm you. No, I'm me. I'm me, he says.
This feels like a bit from Arrested Development. Who wrote this line? It's not even the funniest one in the series. There's almost nothing to talk about with Recoded except for the fact that it includes the line, "Mickey, it's Riku. They put bugs in him." To which Mickey responds with, "What?" I mean, yeah, man. I guess that's how I would respond too. The game is interesting in a different meta way, with the position it has on the release timeline, and by the nature of being on a Game Boy cartridge, it is a stopgap between the two games you actually care about. And there's a lot of ways that this shows up, the most obvious to me being the introduction of Organization 13, but without a lot of the aesthetics that they're commonly associated with. Kingdom Hearts has a strange but unique style in the first installment. Hence the shoes. It evolved into pure Backstreet Boys fluff by the time of the second game, which bleeds into the organization. Most of their architecture is what a 2000 commercial thinks the inside of an iMac looks like. Castle Oblivion blurs the lines between these two styles. It's very Traverse Town on the outside, this hasn't happened yet, it doesn't count, and the world that never was on the inside. Technically it's Traverse Town on the inside too, but that's like a dream, so it doesn't count. The castle is interesting and does feel unique compared to much of the series' original locations, even while in this prototype stage, and if the rest of the game was extrapolated outwards from that, it could have created a visual language that stood out even to this day and help alleviate the feeling like you've done this before. You know, because you have. These aren't even issues the developers needed to fix. It holds the game back a little bit in the remake, even with the extended cutscenes, but when placed back into the context of being a game on the Game Boy Advance, its limitations and lack of new worlds are far less of an issue, and the isometric cutouts remain charming. In the remake, these rooms do reuse assets and unfortunately feel like a cut-down version of Kingdom Hearts 1 rather than a beefed-up version of Chain of Memories, which is what it is. The real reason to play this is either for the combat or for the story, which means the story. It's a lot of fun to talk about the combat from a design perspective, especially in a real-world sense, how it relates to the challenges of porting the real-time combat of the first game down to controls that Amoeba would find cramped. Instead of RPG elements, the team focused more on the card game systems, keeping much of the gameplay fairly accurate to the first while also slowing it down in order to function better on such a limited control scheme. There is a compelling risk and reward to the system, balancing your deck not just with card types but card strengths, as a larger number will cancel a weaker one except for 0, which is broken by and breaks everything. And then you have stocking cards, which can be used for slights, piling 3 cards together, creating either unique effects, stringing attacks, or protecting weaker cards at the cost of removing the first one in the stock from that specific battle. Along with ally cards that spawn periodically and enemy cards that have unique effects, some of which rather dramatically changing the game, there is a lot of meat on the bone, most of it in the original and has not been repeated since. In practice, the implementation of it leaves a lot to be desired, as despite being one of the most content-rich games on the platform, it seems that the developers were worried about it coming up short, and artificially stretch out a lot of the tertiary mechanics that end up having substantial knock-on effects. Amassing a series of cards to mix and match deck setups is fascinating and pretty engaging in almost every card game I have ever played. It's getting the card that sucks. For example, the majority of enemy cards from regular Heartless are simultaneously pretty resource expensive, not very useful, and kind of rare. It is useful having multiple decks so that you can experiment, and it feels like you're supposed to rotate through decks throughout the game, focusing on fire, ice, magic, summons, slights, etc., but it's almost always more beneficial to create a deck you do not need to change. Since your capabilities are almost entirely defined by your deck, and all combat is either exclusively against groups or bosses with ample time to switch, all experimentation devolves into iterations of the same 2 decks with progressively larger numbers. That's not necessarily an issue, as that itself can be rewarding, but the process of collecting and managing cards is absolutely infuriating, and the reason I never finished it as a child. The Keyblades have been adapted to unique cards and maintain their own stats and effects beyond just the number system, which can open up even more deck variations, like placing Keyblades with strong strikes in front of cards with a strong finish, or using certain elemental types against specific bosses. But again, everything's just slightly off to the point where it becomes a hassle to meaningfully interact with it, resulting in situations where you could spend the time to farm for and integrate a frost-based card, or you could just spend less time and take him to the hit him with a stick zone, population U. Cards can drop somewhat frequently, but you lack a consistent way to stack the odds in your favor. For instance, every card appears from the same drop pool, with the distribution changing depending on the floor. The problem is, the sheer number of cards drastically dilutes the card pool, meaning that the further you get into the game, the more spread out your options become, making it more than likely your deck is just an assortment of junk that you've picked up along the way, rather than a carefully crafted tool for any specific strategy. I have finished the game multiple times at this point, and every run featured a different card that I had significantly less of, and to the average player, it's not entirely clear why this would happen. This system makes it very easy to get a lot of stuff, but very obtuse to get something you might actually want. And the result is that the stats are more of a fun quirk, because the most dependable attack in the game is the default Kingdom Key, because it's the only one that drops at any level of consistency. The side effect of limiting drop rates based on the floor is that you have to choose between either pushing forward or halting your progress, for maybe over an hour as you grind out a Keyblade that you just have a particular fondness for. Magic is significantly worse. It appears the drop rates are designed to incentivize their use as a tertiary option, much like how they were supposed to be used in the first game, and as a result, the drop rates are consistently low. The problem is, some of them are just way too low. Cure starts at a low drop rate and gets worse and then disappears for the latter half of the game. If you only rolled useless numbers when you got them, then on higher difficulties your progress is more or less halted until you grind out enough copies, which the game doesn't tell you where the card even drops, and if you want to include summons in your deck, you're probably just not going to be able to. This problem can be partially alleviated by the Moogle shop as long as you dump in the excess or useless cards to essentially re-roll them. But again, the developers seemed really concerned that it was just too useful as a tool to circumvent excessive grinding, so the numbers are just insane. Further into the game, you unlock more expensive packs with the benefit of getting a higher average value, but your ability to earn the shop's currency doesn't really scale at the same pace. Along with that, the drop pool is also still extremely diluted, and for many of the cards, the highest chance to roll them has the lowest average value. But the best packs don't even drop them, which essentially homogenizes all of the results. A very important factor of game design that is often under-discussed and underappreciated is the game's ability to encourage you to play inefficiently, and in turn, interact with the mechanics in a way that is natural and fun. Every game's mechanics are set in stone. Even ones that attempt to adapt or randomize themselves follow patterns. There will always be a meta. There is no chance that something mysterious will show up or the effect of a move obscured. Fun games provide feedback, and you can use that feedback to tailor a more effective approach. While some people enjoy min-maxing their experiences, most people do not, and enjoy using a large variety of mechanics as they see fit for whatever reason, even just aesthetics. This is mostly impossible for multiplayer games, and the only one I've found that does it kind of right is ironically Warframe, where everything's at least kind of viable, and forcing builds that you think are just kinda cool into actually being good is half of the fun. Single-player games still struggle with this, but it's much more possible. There's definitely a theoretical, super efficient way to play Abiotic Factor, but the exploding sledgehammer is cool, and since there's no enemy players to punish me, as long as I'm above the minimum threshold, the game will just keep progressing. Chain of Memories ends up being so limiting and perhaps more important, obviously padded, that it becomes an exercise of maximizing everything you do. One deck has a bunch of lines and then eventually mega flares, and the other just has a bunch of lethal frames. It sucks because none of this is really fun or engaging. It's actually very cowardly, but when the alternative is playing for 30, maybe 40 plus hours, which rivals the mainline series despite having less content, you can keep the moral high ground. I need to be places. Certain cards in your deck can be turned into premium versions, lowering the cost of that card with the downside of it only being usable once per fight no matter what, encouraging you to use it as part of a slight, as the first card is discarded anyway. By sheer happenstance, the culmination of all of these pressure points is that the time stop slight is just the most effective way to complete the game. And unlike Moogle points, premium cards can be easily controlled by the player and in turn, extremely easy to get. It's one of the few resources you can directly control. Progression through the levels starts off relatively engaging before rapidly shifting into monotonous tedium towards the end of the game. The basic flow is this. You choose a world each floor, use map cards to progress through the level, reliving certain moments, back to Castle Oblivion, cutscene, boss fight, repeat ad infinitum. Again, this is not a problem. I am describing the process of most games. Things do not sound impressive when you simplify them for the purpose of brevity. The real issue comes with the aforementioned padding. Not to shoot a dead horse out of a cannon, but the binary nature of the card system heavily encourages you to only play strong cards. Having a stronger deck than your opponent will allow you to stonewall any action they try, crushing even the possibility of retaliation under your deck. But in reverse, having a much weaker deck makes the fights literally unwinnable because you struggle to break cards, and unlike level locked runs in other games, you are not safe from retaliation mid-combo. Maybe you can slip in a single weak card somewhere in the string, but rather quickly the bosses get numerically stronger and the Heartless more numerous. In order to make the game somewhat manageable, you will need cards, Moogle points, and the experience to use them. The game grinds to a halt every time you start a fight, and there are only so many variations that can appear. You may have noticed that much of the combat in my footage looks similar and is being dealt with in a similar fashion. That is because not dealing with it in the fastest possible way is exhausting, and you will be doing it thousands of times. You may have assumed that building 2 decks, one for bosses and one for groups, was an exercise in overcoming obstacles, like accruing an arsenal to account for any situation that arises, staying prepared. It is instead an exercise in time saving. If you can complete this fight, you can absolutely demolish this one. The difference is whether or not it takes 20 seconds or 3 minutes. Because of the way that the card system works, the actual level of execution has been lowered considerably. This is a holdover of being on the Game Boy Advance. You cannot expect players to react and execute commands with a specific level of accuracy. It just isn't feasible. The downside is, if you have the tools or resources to win a fight, you are going to win that fight. The execution is just not really relevant until you get to the boss fights. I don't know how exactly to describe it in a way that doesn't sound like I'm just being lazy, but at some point the sheer quantity just wears you down. I think it has something to do with the sameness of every battle. You will rotate through the same 4 enemy formations every floor, going in with the same deck, and there isn't much room for spontaneity or strategy adjustments that are just more common in the rest of the series. Ironically, I think it would have been a more enjoyable experience if, in the remake, they made it shorter and beefed up some of Riku's campaign. I like the story of his redemption, but it does feel weird that it all happens in between the floors. It would have been nice for him to express his feelings on specific memories. Monstro stands out as an obvious example. The slights that you gain access to towards the end of the game are undoubtedly cool, but by then the novelty has more than worn off. It feels weird to stretch out so much of Sora's playthrough but leave Riku so barren. There's not even any cutscenes. You just run to the boss fights and then leave. A notable difference to Sora's boss fights is that the game doesn't automatically place you in the save room that connects to the next floor, meaning that you have to make your own way there. This could be for plenty of reasons, but I have to imagine it was a way to hide the length of the floors. Many of Sora's levels include cutscenes that are basically one-to-one remakes of cutscenes from the first game, which is disappointing, but at least gives the player something different. Without those, Riku can blast through floors. Neverland took 6 minutes to complete, and I spent 2 of those fighting generic mobs in the same arena that I've been fighting them in for the last 12 hours. The map cards you actually use to progress adds a small, but I think, rewarding level of enjoyment, deciding in the moment what you want or need in the next room, and it does help break up some of the monotony by giving you at least a little bit of agency. It has its own flaws, thankfully one that alleviates a burden from the player, so I consider it a feature. Much like the deck building, the stringent requirements of viability, in this case down to a specific number and card types, means that you are encouraged to collect as many as possible, one dropping from each battle. The result of which is, despite what the game implies, you will have plenty of beneficial cards for whatever the situation needs. There's a handful of harmful maps that benefit the heartless, and I assume that they are the hard decision that you must make if you are running low on resources. Do I grind for a better card, or do I just try and power through it? But even with the blood sacrifices that must be made, just going from one room to another, you will have a glut of choices until the final stretch. It feels strange, almost like the system was designed for the map cards to drop infrequently or only from specific types of fights. Because one drops each fight and experience is significantly more important in this game than any other in the series, you will probably max out your allotment immediately. It would have made more sense if the red cards all had negative effects, instead of some of them having pretty extreme negative effects and some of them being beneficial. Even in situations where the only card that you have that is 7 or above is extremely negative to you, why would you not just grind for more cards? Map cards are important the entire game. Unless you are making your final run at the end of Castle Oblivion, why would you ever feel the need to rush it? You're going to need these cards on the next floor, so just get more cards. While I've dedicated a lot of words to these issues, that is a product of attempting to accurately describe them, not of severity. The battles suck and are pretty annoying, they're only really fun in how quickly you can end them, but I feel that this is more of a missed opportunity that they could have done something better with. The card system creates strange interactions and stonewalls progress, while the map cards never really work the way they were designed, but these are just extremely common issues with RPGs and JRPGs in specific. Tying most of the game's mechanics down to a hard number is always a risk, as it creates a hidden machine, infinite in its complexities, that is also extremely fragile and usually kind of sucks. Implemented correctly, it can offer engaging and memorable experiences, but getting even a single digit wrong in an important system can have cascading negative effects that usually results in the now infamous stigma JRPGs have of requiring excessive grinding at multiple points. This isn't a great implementation of what they put to paper, but the boss fights are decently fun, and at least the boring stuff is pretty easy to skip. Riku's campaign was actually more memorable and enjoyable because it lacked those mechanics. Every time you level up, you get the same 3 options as Sora, but instead of unlocking slights, his deck is predetermined, the numbers just get bigger. You still get a lot of the minor strategy elements of using the deck, especially with the duel mechanic, but it circumvents the painful process of collecting cards, which ultimately holds the deck building back. Beyond that, breaking an enemy card feels rather poor, to the point where the game calling attention to it feels a little misleading. The stun is so short and so pathetic that after breaking an enemy's attack, your next attack can be broken by that enemy. Given that the cards are a semi-limited resource, it feels rather terrible when a slight gets broken or an attack just misses because of 3D space and strange hitboxes. This is mostly an issue of the remake, as it's carried over from the clunky nature of Kingdom Hearts 1, except it's more prevalent here, because wasting a card only to miss because of something you can't control feels particularly awful. There are some oddities with how the fights work. Only one card can be active in the battle at any time, so group fights are like that weird action movie trope where there's a bunch of dudes circling the hero but only one of them attacks him at a time. But since there's so many of them, the mediocre cards get drowned by the sheer quantity of cards the group can throw out, even if it's only one of them attacking at a time. This also makes moves with any amount of wind-up essentially useless on bosses and difficult to use against groups, but conversely makes it very annoying to do basically anything like using an item or healing if a boss just has a slight on the field and you don't have a 0. There are, however, moments where this oddity just becomes kinda clunky when bosses use some kind of long drawn-out animation and you just have to stand there, even when there's no threat. It's even worse in group fights. In other Kingdom Hearts games, or in truth most games, you are supposed to use downtime to heal or replenish some kind of resource. Items and healing, however, need to compete for the same usage that everything else does. The only thing that you can really do in this situation is replenish your deck, an action that you most likely do not need to do and has negative consequences, the result of which is you stand around awkwardly a lot more than other games in the series. Additionally, since you mostly can't see enemy decks, it doesn't always necessarily feel like you are battling one deck with another, as there are situations where the lack of clarity can feel like having a deck and the boss just says, well, I have the same deck, but it's actually infinity +1. It would be like playing poker with someone who kept their hand up their sleeve. Like, sure, you're probably not cheating, but I do not like these optics. None of these are deal breakers, there are just some particular sore spots where these problems are more noticeable, but for the most part, it's just a hindrance for completionists or the idea of replaying the game. I have not done so since completing it for this very reason, in spite of its other positive traits, of which there are many. I mentioned before that the original's pixel art remains charming to me even to this day, but the remake isn't a slouch. It's a testament to the art direction of the series that none of the characters look out of place in either Kingdom Hearts 2 or the original Chain of Memories. Castle Oblivion, as mentioned before, exists in a place above the recycled worlds by the simple fact that it's new and I think it stands out on its own merits. It's not a particularly groundbreaking design, but that's only because Kingdom Hearts 2 shows the natural endpoint of a similar aesthetic. It seems pretty clear that the developers weren't entirely certain what Organization 13 would look like, but it would be something like this, but more. Not to jump ahead too much, but the Cavern of Remembrance in Kingdom Hearts 2 shows that in the right context, even this basic version of the style still absolutely works, and arguably with the same intended effect. Much like Utah, the oppressive amount of white is really unsettling because it is exactly the opposite of everything around it. It helps create the sense of unease that is at the core of the story. Every time you complete something familiar, something happy, something joyful, the real world creeps in, and you are slammed back into reality. It's also reminiscent of a clean room, which makes sense for how Namine functions. I don't really know how to describe it, and it ends up becoming part of her visual design, which I really like. The music is obviously amazing. Even the repeated tracks, they're so good, I just don't care. All of the originals work extremely well. The most interesting facet of the music is the original GBA versions, which are a mixed bag. Something that I think is fucking awesome. The obvious lack of space on the cartridge requires either fewer tracks or extreme compression. Instead, they used a pretty good workaround. Instead of just shrinking, cutting, or compressing the music, they have essentially retooled them to function better within the constraints of the system, replacing certain instruments with a big, wide sound or a heavy bass with shorter, punchier samples to approximate it. Traverse Town is one of the most obvious differences, as it sounds like a band of crickets trying to play the original track. There's obviously differences, like the backing instruments and the complexity of the chord progressions as to not muddy the real estate they had, drowning out everything else, and it creates this slim, maximum efficiency version that's still really good on its own. Not every song can be converted this way, like some music just requires bass or complex sequences, there is no getting around it. 13th Struggle is the most obvious. It's the first time the track appears in a game, I think, and while you can chalk up some of the differences up to just being unfinished, it's the exact type of track that does not lend itself well to simplification. For one, the BPM is in the fucking stratosphere. There's 20 fucking instruments, at least 90% of the beats have a snare hit on them, and some of them more than one. To me, it's one of the best video game tracks of all time and solidified Yoko Shimomura as one of the most impressive video game composers of all time, but it feels designed not to be playable on the Game Boy Advance. Which isn't to say that it doesn't still work in some capacity. Paired with the context of the story, even these low-fidelity versions of the songs can evoke actual emotion. Chain of Memories continues the tradition of the first game by being stupid, childish, lighthearted, and strangely dramatic all at the same time. The idea of traversing a castle filled with your own memories while you slowly lose them the further you go in search of connecting with someone you lost is such a serious story, with enough literary depth that it's kind of insane that it's being packaged into a Kingdom Hearts spin-off on the Game Boy Advance. It manages to balance being fun and serious surprisingly well, and specifically works because it is a sequel. Seeing the trio so confidently misremember events that you have experienced is unsettling, as you're watching someone's memory decay so quickly that they can't even remember a name that they said a few minutes ago. It's spelt out early into the game as well. Memories are more than just slideshows of things that Sora has done or what spells he can cast. The argument made is that they are his and our own entire sense of self. In practice, you are essentially watching Sora die as he progresses, even to the point where memories you would consider to be extremely pivotal are rewritten for the purpose of manipulating him. His memories are so important to who he is that having them is an important piece of having the Keyblade. This is opposed to Riku's campaign, which is just about getting into fistfights with everyone that looks him in the eye. For being introduced in this game, Organization 13 is not exactly portrayed the best that they could be. Chain of Memories makes the bold move of eliminating plot-crucial characters from the roster in a spin-off. Like a lot.
Goodbye.
Sora has 4 members in his story. Axel, Larxene, Vexen, and the ringleader Marluxia, whose ultimate goal is to use Naminé to manipulate Sora's memories and puppet him as a weapon against Xemnas and the rest of the organization that we don't see. Axel isn't part of this and is specifically here on orders from Xemnas, who again we don't know yet, to eliminate traitors, and secretly Vexen is a double traitor. In Riku's campaign, we're introduced to Zexion and Lexaeus, who along with Vexen intend to use Riku to stop Marluxia. It's not entirely clear because everyone enjoys being vague. This is, from a design perspective, kind of an insane decision. Again, it's in a spin-off game on a portable device that has to fit into a few megabytes. It's needlessly complicated and makes the most sense if you've played the DS game that came out after this. Riku's campaign is 3 layers deep into the organization and we still have no idea who the rest of them are or what they really want. It feels like being dropped into a Cold War submarine and everyone's speaking Russian. Could we just slow it down slightly? By the very fact that it is a Kingdom Hearts game, it's difficult to pin down how much of this obtuseness is intentional for the sake of drama, how much of it hasn't been finalized yet, and how much of it is just poor delivery. While it makes sense now, in hindsight, the entire plot revolving around overthrowing Xemnas and the part of the group secretly working to overthrow the Overthrow just doesn't really land as a standalone story. This game is the dramatic culmination of a calendar's worth of inter-office politics that we are just not privy to until much later. There isn't a point to having schisms within the organization when the player doesn't even understand what the Foundation even is. While it's considerably unlikely by the obvious tells, the story doesn't actually bother to explain that Xemnas is in fact a villain. He sounds like a villain, and people refer to him as a villain, but if these guys are evil, maybe he's secretly good. That's obviously not true, all of these groups are different flavors of evil, but it's strange to leave in so much ambiguity, so it does feel like skipping a few seasons of a TV show. In the video I made on the first game, this comes up a surprising amount, but reading the story and themes beyond what the game explicitly specifies is dangerous. It can be tempting to see the fact that Riku sneaks into Castle Oblivion at the bottom as a symbolic representation of the underhanded tactics by organization members to overthrow their superior with him at the center. This also aligns with how these 3 are portrayed. Thinking through their actions, Vexen's love of data and experiments, but this isn't the case. He just shows up and none of these guys knew about it. They were trying to overthrow Marluxia and Riku just fell into their lap. Nothing about their plan necessarily makes that much sense either. Sora is having his memories removed for Marluxia's machinations and these guys want to stop that. Riku also wants to stop that, but Vexen's grand idea is to create a replica of Riku that does the same thing. It feels like there's supposed to be some kind of parallel between Sora and Riku both being primed and loaded and then pointed at their enemies, but that mostly occurs out of happenstance and convenience. A part of the story that I feel is undeniably intentional is the stark comparison between Sora's narrative, where he struggles against manipulation from shadowy figures who promise what he wants the most, and Riku's story, where he deals with the aftermath of that exact situation. While a lot of language used in cutscenes is very "my friends are my power" coded for a lack of a better phrase, the underlying themes are interesting. It has the progression of a bottle episode of sorts, where Riku is essentially haunted by the lingering ghost of fake Ansem within him, while he struggles with the pull of darkness manifesting from his fears, desires, and shame. It's essentially like playing through the journey of a recovering alcoholic. He even has his own sponsor. It's Mickey Mouse, for some reason, and he calls him His Majesty even though Mickey is not his reigning monarch. Bootlicker much? His campaign does a lot to soften how genuinely crazy he appears in the first game, and it is refreshing to have him just admit that he was wrong and that he's trying to change. For a series that is filled to the brim with do-no-wrong platonic embodiments of light, it is interesting to watch Riku grapple with very real emotions, and eventually accept the fact that he's simply not Sora, and just a guy with temptations who makes bad decisions. After defeating his embodiment of Ansem, his now best friend Mickey Mouse from the cartoons points out that the darkness inside of him belongs to him, the same way the light does, and it's the choices he makes that will matter more than what's inside of him. Being surrounded by evil caricatures and the literal, canonical pure of heart, it could be easy to push him to the side, pronounce that he has been fixed, hand wave away his past actions, which makes it so much more interesting that they decided to give Riku a surprisingly grounded story, where he has to come to terms with the failures of his past and how it fortifies his decisions in the future. He did all of this stuff because he wanted to, and he's doing all of this stuff because he also wants to, but it's pointed out that one has directly caused the other. It's such a dramatic shift in character development, it's impressive they can get it done so succinctly in time for the second game. The story does a good job of explaining what makes up both Sora and Riku, because we get to understand Sora better through the parts of him that start to disappear, and Riku through the reasons he has to resist temptation. Namine, a nobody constructed from Kairi's heart, but from Sora's body and soul, which isn't a nobody, that's just a person, but whatever, also builds into this narrative. There's a recurring theme among the heroes, that the decision to do the right thing is what matters. Once you believe it, then all else falls into place. You have become immutable. Even as Sora loses his memories, he remains mostly the same. A lot of the language used implies that despite everything, there is a part of him inside that cannot be touched. Decisions made and friendships forged. It's an extremely simple premise, but a pretty compelling one. Despite the pressures from Marluxia, Namine undermines him at every opportunity, and to infer from the text, you could argue that the attempts to manipulate Sora don't work because she doesn't want them to work. Sora even says that despite everything, that he has a genuine connection with her, that they are friends. As I mentioned before, Riku is the most compelling example of this. He's the only one of the three that really understands what's happening to him because he brought his own baggage, and as a result, the self-affirmation becomes almost ritualistic from the moment he enters Castle Oblivion. While getting bailed out by Mickey feels like a writing cop-out to some, I want to point out that these Deus Ex Machina moments only happen to the heroes of the story. Riku has at this point not received that. He was a petty, arrogant child that became more of those things as the first game progressed, except for the child, he was always the same amount of child. He doesn't get a traditional heel turn, where he just snaps out of it at the end, in his dying breath, and everything turns out okay. He is very much living through the consequences of poor choices. But understanding himself better and actually putting his friends first, he protects himself almost in a narrative sense. To the point where, at the end of the game, he chooses not to join Sora and purge his darkness in a deep sleep, choosing instead to face it himself. A decision that would seem arrogant and destined to fail if he made it at the start of the game. But by establishing himself as a hero in this story, and in the minds of the players, his success is all but guaranteed and proof of his newfound maturity. It seems quite accidentally, the ominous and vague posturing by the organization formed in part from a lack of knowing what the final build of KH2 would be, means you can mostly ignore it and focus on the main characters. A lot of these guys end up being pretty cool. In Chain of Memories, they can usually just be described with a single sentence, if not a single word. Axel gets the biggest piece of the pie, and it isn't wasted. Much like Riku, he gets a lot of genuine development, much of it on the screen, which is uncommon for this series, and I can't believe I just said that out loud. There's a lot of phrases used by characters that sound very abstract for things that should be very easy to describe, like when they say, "the darkness inside of me, but their biggest crime is forgetting to unload the dishwasher." When Riku says it, you know what he means, because he was kind of a dick. When Axel says it, you know what he means, because he's like a war criminal. KH2 depicts him as a short-tempered, emotional fighter with a sarcastic streak. While it isn't strange that he's considered the assassin of the group, he's no more aggressive than the other members, and it could be argued that at least one of them is outwardly crueler. In Chain of Memories, He is genuinely a wild card and a hazard to keep in the group. He's sadistic, mocking, eager for violence, a cold-blooded murderer, and completely apathetic towards the idea of a hostage. The things that you would assume are important, like Namine, or the function of Organization 13, which are pretty big holes in the story, don't really matter as much as you think they should, as they sort of get explained better or in a more interesting way later. So even though this is the first time a lot of these characters or plot points appear in the story, they don't really matter outside of the most basic application, like bad guy, hostage, etc. The biggest issue the story adds is the Riku replica, which introduces the extremely and needlessly complicated existence of replicas. But individually, he's mentioned like twice across 20 real-life years until he suddenly becomes a plot-crucial character for 5 minutes. This is something you are not supposed to do when writing stories, but given that the series regularly revives characters off-screen with little explanation and eventually introduces the most convoluted version of time travel I've ever seen, we are grading on an extremely steep curve. For the purpose of this story, you can treat him as the fake that does not know he is the fake. Cue, I'm actually better than you. I'm me, he says. Let's fight to prove it. I'll remember this. Adios. You've seen it before. A takeaway that I apply to the game itself. There's a lot here narratively, if you bend the story to traditional norms and outright ignore the factors that rely on future information. The organization is more interesting as the friction for Sora and Riku's journeys than the web of intricate personalities that the story presumes they are, because those personalities just aren't strong enough to carry a lot of the scenes alone. On the other hand, 358 by 2 Days adds a significant amount of context to the point where Chain of Memories is almost like the final act of that game, but is also part of the horrifically bad trend the series has of kicking the onus of plot or character development down the road. These characters are interesting, but they're not interesting in this game, which is annoying because this is the one you're playing. I can still recommend the game pretty easily, especially on lower difficulties, to mitigate the grinding required. It has plenty to offer on Proud Mode, but I struggle to see the majority of people enjoying that kind of experience. All in all, it's a moderately fun game that has a surprisingly mature story marred by a type of convoluted and IOU style of delivery that would become synonymous with the series, and they're only on the second game. A lot of the positive traits even apply to the original, which I still think holds up at least kind of well, and has other benefits the remake doesn't. Like, the slower combat speed means that card breaks actually matter a lot more. So, you know, if you have 30 hours to spare, there are better uses than this, but you know, hey, this could be one of them. So, thanks for watching.